One of the biggest cocaine busts in our history, 720 million rands worth of the drug intercepted in Port Elizabeth, hidden on the bottom floor of a ship under more than 3,000 containers. What a bust, what a victory.
So various countries were involved. From Brazil, it docked in South Africa. We know that from South Africa it was going to Singapore. From Singapore, it would have ended in India, which is where we believe that the consumption was supposed to take place.
But that's just scratching the surface. The fight against drugs will take much longer than we think. A 2018 International Narcotics Control Report says South Africa is the largest market for illicit drugs in sub-Saharan Africa, and both a destination and transit stage for traffickers, serving as a transshipment point for cocaine and heroin, primarily destined for Europe. To discuss this, we have in our Durban studio Brigadier Ebrahim Kadwa, Section Head for the Hawks Serious Organised Crime. He's joined by criminologist Simon Howell in Cape Town, Shaun Shelly, Deputy Secretary of the UN Vienna NGO Committee on Narcotic Drugs on Skype. In Johannesburg, I'm with Natrishka Naidoo, Director of the Assisted Recovery Centres of Africa. A very good evening to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us. Shaun Shelly, let me start off with you. Tell us about the findings of South Africa and its role in transiting drugs.
Well, we know that South Africa is a transit and a consumer point. We know that West Africa has long been a transit and consumer point as well. I would contest that we can say categorically that South Africa has got a particularly bigger problem than any other part of Africa, especially considering the size of our population, considering some of the other countries. And I don't think there's accurate data to support that. And I think that it's a bit of a leap. But any country around the world is both a transit and consumption country to some degree. And also, considering that we're at the tip of Africa and we've got a lot of transport points around us, we're going to be one of the countries that people bypass, and this is not a function of, our borders are particularly porous or something like that. This is just a function of geography, and the fact is that every country's got these kind of issues.
But what exactly are we looking at here? What is the extent of this trade, and what is happening inside South Africa to allow this to occur?
So the trade is transnational and it's global, and the fact is that the people that we're dealing with at this kind of level of the current haul of 706 tons of cocaine, these are transnational criminal organizations. They are very well equipped, they're very well resourced, and we're talking about billions of dollars here. This 706 kilos is a massive haul by anybody's standards, but it's not going to disrupt the supply of drugs around the world. In the South African context, I think that the consumption of drugs, or the dependent consumption of drugs, is actually led by alcohol rather than any of the other drugs. But if we look at the drugs that are unregulated, we would say that actually it's more socioeconomic conditions that are driving it than just simply the availability of drugs. It takes much more than the availability of drugs to create a problem with drugs in society.
And considering the amount of money, does a country like South Africa and other countries in Africa become fertile ground for this sort of trade to happen? It's easier here.
We know that any country that's undergone rapid political change and opens up its borders in terms of international trade is going to become vulnerable to the importation of drugs. But look, a consignment of this size was going past South Africa. They weren't about to offload it here. It was certainly going past here. Most of the drugs that come into South Africa happen through air transport or over land, although there are some big hauls that come in via sea as well. We know that. But I don't think that we should say that this is going to disrupt any of the drug trade in South Africa, although it is going to disrupt that particular criminal network on a transnational level, which is, I believe, a good thing. The fact of the matter is that these people are going to trade in whatever commodity they can trade in, and our policies have created an incredible value chain for drugs. Something that you can purchase for $4 in Brazil or Colombia sells for $100 to $200 on the streets of New York. That's a massive margin. It means that there are massive resources, and there's very little we can do to actually stop the flow of drugs totally.
Okay, Shaun Shelly, we're going to let you go, but thank you very much for sharing your experience with us. Before I bring in my other guests, just to remind you that if you want to call in with a question for my guests, please do so. We'll take your call. Brigadier, the incredible drug haul that you made in Port Elizabeth on Monday was raised there. Talk us through what that suggests about what's happening here in South Africa and the sort of control that the police have on it or not.
Good evening, Jane. I think what is important is firstly to understand illicit drugs is a global phenomenon and the most lucrative transnational organized crime enterprise. Every country and every region in the world is affected by drugs, and the global drug landscape is constantly diversifying and evolving, and where they are constantly seeking new routes and markets. Now, in terms of the cocaine bust we have made on Monday, this we consider a very significant breakthrough, and this is generated with the frontline investments that we are making at our border posts, as well as being able to ensure that we are more vigilant in the way that we are able to provide drug law enforcement at our borders, harbors, as well as our major centers around the country.
I mean, an extraordinary amount in kilos and value, and the way it was hidden under, hundreds of craters apparently. What is the conversation that you are having with other law enforcement agencies around the world in order for this to stop happening? And how much of all of this is an insider's job?
I think it is important to emphasize that no police agency or country can, in an isolated fashion, deal with a global challenge. And that's why you need global responses. And in positioning ourselves in dealing with transnational organized crime, in particular drug trafficking, we have placed a high premium in basically placed a high premium on regional and international cooperation. So what we are doing is increasingly strengthening our cooperation and our footprint in the region with our neighboring African countries as well as internationally. And many of the cases that the Hawks is dealing is looking at a national and transnational dimension, where we are able to work increasingly and in a more closer way with our international law enforcement partners. And this is allowing ourselves to be more effective, to be more vigilant in terms of what is happening in the global drug arena.
Okay. Dr. Simon Howell, what do you make of the latest developments in the last week and our status of being, well, so good at it in sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to note that this is a good thing, and that, the Hawks have worked incredibly well to catch these people and to make this bust. But what for me is important to note is that, or to question how we define success. Is the success, or are we winning the war on drugs, so to speak, by virtue of how many people we arrest or how many kilograms we confiscate? Or are we, we've been doing this for the last 20 years, and the question that remains, have we managed to make a dent in the trade? And
well, it just seems to get worse,
I don't think we have. So the question then is, so what are we doing something wrong, or do we need to do something different? And I think it's important to recognize that we can't solve this problem, or that we can ever completely eradicate a society of drugs. Drugs are deeply embedded within them, whether they be legal or illegal. And therefore, we need better ways of managing the problem, so to speak.
Natrishka, you see those pictures, it all seems like another world, really far away. You see it on a daily basis.
Yes, of course.
Talk us through the reality of what's happening in South Africa.
Well, I am speaking from the private sector, obviously, and that covers maybe about 10% of our population at the moment. But what we're seeing, whereas in the past, alcohol was considered one of the highest reasons to enter rehabilitation, now we're seeing that something like heroin is actually on par and even overtaken people coming into treatment. So there's an enormous amount of addiction that's happening in our country.
Extraordinary problem then, isn't it?
No, of course it is.
What's linked to it. And is it, I mean, okay, so heroin, alcohol, are you seeing new drugs coming through all the time?
So I think that's also part of the problem, that drug dealers and drug manufacturers have gotten more creative. Compared to 20 years ago, there's a far bigger variety of drugs nowadays. But unfortunately, a lot of outdated treatment methods are still being used to treat these addictions. And I think that's where we're struggling as well. And that's why the addiction in South Africa has gotten to epidemic proportions at the moment.
And Simon, tell us about the drug routes. I know a lot comes in from Afghanistan, clearly Brazil behind this latest cocaine bust. How does it get transported and where does it end up generally?
Well, it depends which drug you were talking about, but in the instance of cocaine, for instance, I mean, the primary destination of consumption is Europe. So one of the conduits is through Africa and South Africa because the Atlantic between Britain and North America is policed too heavily. So essentially the conduits emerge in places where policing is minimal or where it's easier to do so. So this is why West Africa has also become quite prominent in the global trade, because it's a very easy area to essentially use as a means of providing drugs to Europe. Heroin, on the other hand, primarily comes from the Middle East and then is moved downwards through to Europe in the opposite way, from the east to the west. Again, being Africa is easier to deal with, so to speak, in terms of drug supply because the enforcement is less stringent and the coasts are long and it's difficult to police an entire coastline, especially in somewhere like South Africa.
Brigadier, I should imagine that understanding these trade routes is very important to put a stop to this. But do you ever get to the man, the woman at the top? I believe there have been no arrests since the latest drug haul. Why is that?
Well, as you have already been told by Shaun, that particular consignment was in transshipment to Singapore and eventually to India.
But sorry, can I just jump in here? I mean, can you assume that they had people in South Africa who would know that this is bypassing?
Well, our investigations will eventually determine what exactly is the nature and extent of this transnational drug trafficking network. But what we are definitely going to do is we are going to conduct follow-up investigations with our international counterparts in order to try and identify and then work out how will be the best way for us to arrest and prosecute these drug traffickers. And I think with the levels of cooperation that we enjoy with our international partners and in terms of the transnational focus that we are having, we are very determined and resilient that we will take this matter and other matters forward in terms of what we are dealing. I think you have spoken to Simon about the heroin trafficking routes. So from Afghanistan, we have what is now called the southern route. And just to illustrate that in the last 3 years, the South African Narcotics Enforcement Bureau, together with SARS, has been very effective in being able to intercept huge consignments of heroin entering through the southern route, through our neighboring countries on our land borders, and it is unprecedented. We are taking in shipments of 50 kilos upwards. But what is important is the intelligence that we are generating, is the frontline law enforcement that we are deploying at our border posts, upping our game, and all of this is certainly going to help us to be able to more effectively and more holistically deal with the illicit drug trade. And what is also very important is in 2016, the government established the South African Narcotics Enforcement Bureau, and this bureau is dedicated to address in a very holistic way the drug supply chains. And I can tell you that with the establishment of SANEP, we have been making significant milestones in being able to dismantle clandestine drug laboratories. As one of your guests has indicated, that there is a variety of drugs, and the drug trade, yes, there is a cocktail of drugs that are on the market.
Okay,
but what is important
let me just jump
is
in
our
here.
ability.
Okay, so your ability is clearly improving, but I mean, you are seeing more people taking drugs. So, it's been stopped, but are you getting a sense of where the production is coming from? I mean, I'm sure you get a lot of people talking to you about their experience and their access. What do they say?
So, from our patients, there's obviously a variety of routes. Everyone starts at their dealer level and works their way up. And very often there is some gang involvement that happens there. With most of our patients, though, what we're finding is that they're living in these communities where the drug dealers have basically taken over. And it's flooded on the streets. They step out of their house and there's a dealer on their corner.
And are they encouraged? I should imagine that it's good for business to dangle it in front of you.
Yes, it is. And most dealers are actually, giving it away free the first few times, just in order to get people hooked. So that is a big danger that happens here. And obviously, it goes up the ranks and goes right up the ranks to those, 1 or 2 people that you were talking about. But the main thing I think that's affecting our communities is our current socioeconomic status. Because apart from the fact that, yes, we seem to be a hub of drugs in Southern Africa, is the fact that that has allowed us to have increased affordability and accessibility to these drugs. And if you get a school child that can afford drugs, and we're getting phone calls for kids as young as 12, now that's a terrifying age. So taking Niobe, taking Wunga, which is heroin. So if it's gotten that accessible that school children can get a hold of it, it's painting a very frightening picture of what's happening in terms of addiction in South Africa right now.
Simon, should it be tackled more harshly? I mean, if as we were hearing there, criminals are just or gangsters are just handing it out, and children are taking it, I mean, should we be dealing with this in a different way?
I think we should be dealing with it in a completely different way, and that's not to be harsher on drugs, so to speak, but rather to realize that drug use emerges out of specific socioeconomic conditions. And if you want to solve, so to speak, drug use, we need to deal with the socioeconomic issues that are driving those. So, putting people in jail and arresting people is not going to ultimately solve the problem, if that is even possible. What it does merely is marginalize people who are already marginalized to such an extent that they can no longer be reincorporated into society. So what we need to do is realize that this is not simply a criminal problem, but rather a socioeconomic problem that occurs and that must be dealt with at that level.
And it seems that it's easier to arrest the small user rather than the one at the top. Why is that such a problem?
Well, there is a difference between supply reduction and demand reduction. So supply reduction is when law enforcement will go after ships and large consignments. Demand reduction is when users are arrested. And over the last 15 years, there's been a constant increase in the number of people who have been arrested for drugs or drug charges in South Africa. And it needs to be asked, has this actually dealt a blow to, or has it dented the drug trade as such, or stopped people using drugs? And the answer is no. I don't think it has. So as a result, we need to ask, are we doing anything by arresting people? Is there any indication here that there is a success? And I don't think there is. But to change this means that we need to change our mindset from understanding success to be numeric and the number of arrests that are made, to success being the number of people whose lives that are put back on a different road.
Okay, Brigadier, what's your response to that?
I think what is important is, as the South African Narcotics Enforcement Bureau, our primary focus is dealing with organized crime and the supply chains, drug supply chains. And in that regard, we have to make a very clear distinction that we are dealing with organized crime, and we have a clear duty to be able to ensure that we can ensure safer communities by eradicating those that are involved in the trafficking and production of drugs. And that is what we are determined and resilient to do, and that is exactly what we are doing. The argument that Simon is putting about the communities, I think, is a very important situation. How do we deal with the socio-economic issues? How do we deal with communities that are creating the demand? But our focus as a Narcotics Bureau is to deal primarily with the drug supply chain and how we can be able to disrupt and dismantle them. And in this area, I believe that we are gaining momentum. We certainly have not achieved the desired levels that we would want, but certainly we are on the journey to a much more safer South Africa as far as trafficking, as far as tackling transnational drug trafficking networks.
Yeah, not a bad start to the year from your point of view, certainly. Natrishka, if we don't deal with this now, I mean, what are we looking at from a society point of view, socio-economic point of view?
I think we're already at the point where we might actually lose an entire generation of our youth if this problem is not dealt with. To give you an example, about a week ago, a TV show that featured us was aired. And in one night, we had about 300 phone calls. People want the help. People are suffering. And addiction is a medical disease. It's recognized internationally as a medical disease. However, in our hospitals, we don't have an addiction unit. We have a diabetes unit, we have hypertension units, and yet the incidence of addiction is higher than diabetes globally. So why is it that we are not providing these services to our public when it's one of the most desperately needed services right now?
All right, well, thank you, all three of you. Natrishka, Naidoo, with that plea, Dr. Simon Howell and Brigadier Ebrahim Kadwa. Thank you. Coming up, know the world and stay informed in our new weekly strand. Tonight we tackle the human tragedy behind the US and the Mexico standoff with Al Jazeera's Hodad El Hamid.